to make sure. All right. If anyone ever has any trouble with emailing through Blackboard, the system's kind of weird. I think sometimes the email addresses don't line up perfectly. I have a hard time responding to some people's emails through Blackboard. So if you're unsure whether something has reached me or sent correctly, I would just go find my email address on the syllabus and just email me directly. That way you know it'll get to me.
All right.
Yeah. Those of you who are concerned about the quality of this first hypothesis, I expect you guys to not perfectly get it. That's the whole point of learning. So as long as you submitted something and it looks like you followed the protocol, that it's 4 sentences long, that you include the information I asked for, you should be fine. And I'll give you plenty of feedback.
Okay.
I saw that with the independent variable part in the syllabus, it said it didn't say to list out specific measurements for the experiment, so I didn't do that. Was that all right, not having to list the measurements?
At this stage, you don't have to have a fully fleshed out design, but I did want you to at least operationally define how you would measure the independent variable. So if you are just kind of there are 2 ways you can take this. When you're writing the hypotheses, you're really talking about a relationship between 2 variables. And as you guys learned from the lectures, you can really answer something about a relationship between 2 variables in several different ways. You could use a correlational method where you just kind of have 2 sets of numbers that you're comparing, in which case your independent variable would actually be another set, kind of a set of numbers, right? So if you want to know how, I don't know, someone's score on a personality test, they get like a number on a personality test, is related to whether they use a mask in public. What you're doing is you have 2 sets of, how often they use a mask, how many times per week when they go outside they use a mask. You're comparing 2 sets of numbers. So there, your independent variable is not something you're manipulating. You're just kind of recording it and then comparing it with another set of numbers. So there, with an independent variable, you should be defining, say, what number you're recording, the score on their personality test, or the number of times they go out per week. With an experiment, yeah.
I was gonna say I did that. I just didn't like specifically define experiment and for my independent variable.
That is fine. That is fine. As long as you operationally defined it. Yeah. Once we get to the research proposal, you'll then pick one of you're going to write 3 hypotheses, and then you're going to have to submit a research proposal. You'll then pick one of your hypotheses and really flesh out how you would recruit participants, how you would randomly assign them, et cetera, et cetera. Yep.
Gotcha.
Going to pursue any career in any science, the more you write these things, the better you're going to get. And if you write them about something that you're interested in, you might actually discover something you'd want to do your own research on. So if you are specifically interested, for example, in the stuff that I do research on, human mate, the initiation, the maintenance, the dissolution or breakup of romantic relationships. If you're interested in, consensual non-monogamy, if you're interested in face perception, anything that I went over that first lecture, write stuff about that. I'll let everyone know, I do seek out research assistants for my work, and I recruit from this class and through my 300 level class. So if you are interested in that kind of thing, try to think about some hypotheses you might have about, how do people make consensually non-monogamous romantic relationships work? How do people end up, maintaining a romantic or a sexual partnership with multiple people. Does it work? Does it not? And if it does or does not, what's causing it to work or not? Things like that. Get creative with it. And if you kind of write a few of these hypotheses and you're like, hey, you know what? There's something here I actually would like to pursue, maybe with an independent research project. I'd be happy to, if it's compatible with my research, then we can talk about research assistantships. If it's not, then I may still be interested in kind of hosting that, but I may also be able to redirect you to someone who kind of better fits that interest. So just something to think about. And if anyone is interested in these research assistantships, just realize that at the end of my assistantships, I tend to, the aim is to publish an original peer-reviewed journal article. It's a lot of work. So this is not something to just kind of get into half-heartedly. If you write something and you're really passionate about it and you like it, then follow up on it. Regardless, try to make the hypotheses interesting, something that you genuinely want to know. And then you'll have identified some way to test that hypothesis. Yeah. All right. Any last minute questions about the hypotheses before we move on a little bit? I will be giving you feedback directly on your assignments, so you'll hear from me probably sometime this afternoon on that. Just descriptive methods, or certain methods for actually testing whether a relationship exists between two things. Remember that is the basis of a hypothesis. You are making a prediction that you think X is going to be related to Y in some way. With a correlation, you are just simply mathematically testing whether two things are related, but you're not really seeing why they're related. For example, I believe in one of the lectures I mentioned ice cream sales and instances of sexual assault. It turns out that those two things are correlated. So as sales of ice cream go up, so do instances of sexual assault. Now, does that mean ice cream is causing sexual assault? No, most likely not. There's probably yeah, go ahead, Austin.
Just a quick question. How are those correlated? Because I'm going into criminal justice, for criminal profiling. That's why I'm taking this class. And I'm curious as to how those two correlate.
Why would they?
I'm not entirely sure.
It's fascinating when you can Google. There are all kinds of weird correlations that exist out there, and this is just one of them. But can anyone want to take a guess at that? Why would you observe a correlation between ice cream and sexual assault?
I would guess older the people that are normally sexually assaulted, because normally I see like there's the ice cream man and the kid or something like that, and it seems like maybe if it's younger people I can get that, especially since it's like a running joke and like an actual thing that happens, especially a while back.
Okay, so maybe it's something about the people who tend to sell ice cream, that they also happen to be sexually deviant in that way, or experience a greater tendency to commit sexual assault or rape. That could be. So as far as I know, I don't think that people who sexually assault tend to seek out those professions, but that could be. Yeah.
Or could it be the fact that getting ice cream is a popular first date, and these predators are using it as a means of opportunity?
Okay, sure. So you go outside, you buy ice cream, you do maybe if we looked at other first date activities, such as I don't know how often people go out to restaurants or how often they go to a movie, et cetera, that could also be related to sexual assault. It's just kind of it's something that one does when you're trying to, find a date or go out with someone. Sure. Anyone else want to take a stab at that? There is actually something that seems to explain this association pretty strongly that they've looked into. We haven't figured it out yet. I'll tell you this: it's a much less interesting. It's actually a very mundane reason.
I guess a sexual predator being in one of those ice cream stores or around ice cream increase.
I hadn't heard of that, but that would make sense to me. It could be that ice cream sales are going to be sold where people are vacationing, where they're touring, and so people are coming in from out of state. They're coming in from places where they wouldn't normally be there. So to sexually assault someone that is a tourist is not going to be probably as risky, unfortunately, as say if you were to do it within a community where everyone knows you, right?
Right.
Remember that. Yeah. We need the scientific method to rule out third variables, right? We need specifically experiments, which we're going to get into a little bit more depth today. We need experiments to control for third variables. This seems to be what's happening with ice cream sales and sexual assault. It's not that ice cream and sexual assault are causal, that one doesn't cause the other. What's happening is there is a third variable going on. It turns out when it's hotter outside, when the temperature is increased, people are more likely to sell ice cream because people want to eat ice cream when it's hot. But it turns out when it's hotter outside, you're more likely to see instances of sexual assault. And there might be a few reasons for this. One, people are simply outside more. When it's cold out, when it's like freezing, there just aren't people out. No one's vacationing. No one's, walking around town at night. Everyone's like indoors, cuddled away, safely in their homes, rather than being out and about. The other thing is with heat, and this is something you see for humans, non-humans, pretty much any animal. You put something in an environment where it's hotter than they would prefer. People tend to have kind of shorter tempers. They get angry more easily. There's just physiologically, you can kind of be more kind of aroused, and not sexually aroused, but just physically aroused, and that can lead to more aggression. You see that, for example, in groups of primates. If you see a bunch of chimpanzees or bonobos, or not bonobos so much, but baboons living together, when it's hotter and those bonobos are grouped together and they're kind of out and about, they tend to aggress against each other more. So it seems to be largely explained by heat. The third variable is it's hot both when ice cream sales are higher and when sexual assault tends to happen more often. So there's a third variable there explaining the relationship. So this is the problem with a correlation. Two things can be related because they're both related to a third thing. They're both related to, in this case, the temperature outside, how hot it is. Does that make sense?
That's actually pretty crazy.
Yeah. That's something I don't think the police would even realize. And I mean, that if they realized that or had that information, they could do something to try and prevent near as many cases that are reported, let alone aren't reported.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, you know, a lot of, especially police work, I mean, you're working with a limited pool of public funding, you know, how many officers you can have out at a given time, where you need to direct your effort. And I think that doing this kind of research you can say, okay, well, these are the hotter months. People are going to be out more. They're probably going to be going to bars. They're probably going to be doing X, Y, and Z outside. So this might actually be the prime opportunity. This is the time and the place to be more vigilant of what's happening, say, in a city center, or what's happening outside in parks, et cetera, et cetera. You know, you're not going to be able to pinpoint where a crime is going to occur, but certain crimes might occur more often under certain conditions. And that would be a very good hypothesis to test and see whether it's true. And then you can inform how you use those limited public resources to protect the community, right? Yeah, I think that's a good observation. So this is the limit of a correlation. The limit of a correlation is we can say two things are related, even if they're not causally related, that one doesn't cause the other. So I want to go into and make sure that you guys understand how to design an experiment. That is, how do you figure out whether one thing causes another? So I already introduced this. This is a research design that allows you to conclude that one thing causes another. And how this works is you, as an experimenter, the person who's designing the study, you change an independent variable to see how doing so affects a dependent variable, while controlling for or holding constant all other third variables. So just for clarity, let's define these once again. What is an independent variable? When we're talking specifically about an experiment, what is an independent variable?
The thing that can be manipulated, like an
Okay,
amount.
what do you mean by that? A thing that can be manipulated? I agree, but yes. For those of you who are for people who are unfamiliar with what manipulated means, what does that mean?
You can sort of, like, you have control of the numbers. Like, for example, in the lecture previously about Paxil, there was, like, the thing with Paxil, there was one that was receive 0 milligrams and 15 milligrams and I think 30 milligrams. Like, but you can change that if you wanted to, like, instead of 15, make it 20,
Okay,
or make
good.
a new
So
category.
good. So we're changing a quantity, and we have control over it. All right. Anyone want to add anything to that? What makes the independent variable the independent variable? You manipulate it. Why? What are you trying to do by manipulating it? By changing it like that?
Experiment, for, like, the control group to give to people.
Okay, so we're putting people into these groups, right? So we're creating different groups where in each group the participants receive a different amount of whatever you're changing. So in the case of Paxil, in the case of an antidepressant medication, you are changing how much of the Paxil they receive. The question is, the research question is, does this antidepressant actually alleviate symptoms of depression, right? So you want to see, if I give some people nothing, if I give some people a little bit of the drug, and then I give some people a much higher dose of the drug, am I going to observe any differences between those groups?
Yes, even because every person's going to respond to any medication differently than the next person. Some people are going to be more tolerant, some people are going to be less tolerant.
Yes, very good. And so that, I think, highlights why we need to randomly assign people to each of the groups, right? Because we might end up putting by accident some people, all the people who, maybe the majority of the people who are kind of resistant to the drug, maybe we'll put them in the 60 milligram group, right? In which case, just giving them a higher dose of the drug it's not going to seem like higher doses do much, because those people just by chance happen to be more resistant to the drug, right? And so maybe it looks like 60 milligrams isn't doing much more than 10 milligrams, but really it's something about the people we put into that group. So that's why it's important, if you get a group of people and you want to test a hypothesis, you want to run an experiment, first off, you need to get lots of people, you need to get multiple people. I have a lot of people, when they design experiments for their research proposal, they say, I'll put one person in this group and I'll put one person in the other group. The problem with that is, as you say, if one person happens to not respond to that, or happens to respond to that drug in a really weird way, or they're kind of resistant to it or something, that's a problem. But if you recruit, say, 20 people and put 20 people in each group, then if one of the people of those 20 happens to be kind of resistant or doesn't really respond to the drug in the same way, you still have 19 other people who potentially are going to respond in the way that you think they're going to respond. So first off, it's important that, yes, you recruit multiple people and you randomly put them into one of those groups. This is how you control for third variables. The third variable might be they don't respond to the drug in the same way. There's something about their personal body chemistry that just the drug doesn't work for them. You want to control for that. So how do we control for that? We randomly assign people to groups, to each of those groups. Okay, so the independent variable is the thing that, as the experimenter, you designing the experiment, the thing that you are going to change, you are going to manipulate. So that is, you are going to create multiple groups and then randomly assign people to those groups. Okay, so then what's the dependent variable?
Overall outcome.
Outcome, yes. I think that's the operative word. It is your outcome. It's the thing that you think your independent variable is going to affect. That the independent variable is going to cause a change in the dependent variable, your outcome. So in the case of the Paxil and the depression example, we think that the antidepressant drug Paxil is going to change something about the outcome of how many depressive symptoms a person experiences, or how many, I think the example I used was the number of self-defeating thoughts, how many times you kind of get down on yourself per day. All right. This is important to understand because you're going to have to design these experiments for your research proposal. So you're going to take your hypotheses and then identify what is the independent variable that I'm going to change, what is the dependent variable that I am going to measure, that outcome. And then you're also going to have to consider what are some third variables I might need to account for. And that'll depend on a case-by-case basis. But let's practice this a little bit. I want to linger here because you'll have to do this yourself. So I have a few examples here for you. Here's one question we might want to experimentally test. You might think that marijuana use, using marijuana, smoking weed, is associated with a person's intelligence. And I think that there are predominantly two stereotypical beliefs about this. That is, I think, two predominant beliefs that exist on average. Of course, there's some nuance, but here's either you might subscribe to the idea that if you smoke marijuana, maybe if you do it regularly, that you will be less intelligent. And I think that, that stereotype exists, at least the stereotype exists to the degree that you see it in like, I think for a long time you saw it in you know, popular media where there's always a character who smokes weed and they seem really dumb. I mean, they seem really slow. They might, you know, kind of get distracted super easily. And so I think that's an association that I think we've kind of picked up, and that is a viable hypothesis, right? You might believe that smoking marijuana will then decrease your intelligence. There are then other people, I think on the other side of the bandwagon, who say that marijuana actually makes you more intelligent. And specifically, I think a lot of people argue that it makes you more creative, that it might make, and here's a terminology you can maybe Google if you want to learn more about this, that it increases what's called divergent thinking. That is kind of letting your thoughts go every which direction and think of things that you wouldn't normally think of. So some people argue that it makes you more intelligent. Well, okay, this is a question, this is a belief you may hold. We don't necessarily know the answer to it. There is literature on it, there is actually research, and we'll talk about some of that research when we get to drugs. But for now, how would we go about testing this? These are the questions you should ask yourself. And we'll just go through this, but these are the kinds of questions you should ask yourself when you have a question like this. What is the independent variable that you want to manipulate? What is the dependent variable? How would you operationally define them? Then what is your hypothesis? And then when you're actually designing the experiment, what will you ask participants to do? So in this first example, what are the two variables? What's the independent, what's the dependent variable?
I guess the amount of marijuana that is smoked, and the outcome for the dependent variable would be to observe somebody after smoking X amount of marijuana.
Okay, good. So the independent variable is going to be the thing that we want to change. It's the thing that we think is going to cause something else. We think that smoking marijuana is going to cause a change in intelligence. So the amount of marijuana, that's a good independent variable. How would we measure intelligence? How do you measure that outcome? What makes a person intelligent?
IQ?
Okay, good. So there is a standardized measure called the intelligence quotient, that is IQ. So we could just give an IQ test to someone. How else can we measure? That's a really good way to measure intelligence. It's actually a very well established way to measure intelligence. But are there other ways? Think about, so when you think about maybe just how you think marijuana affects a person, what kinds of things about their intelligence or how their mind works do you think marijuana affects?
It mainly affects the nervous system, but it can numb neurons and make things react slower. There's like slower reaction times while you're on marijuana. And for people that have kind of abused the drug, they can eventually, like if they smoked, their damage, but that's also sort of rare.
Action time is, you might be instructed to hit a key on the keyboard when something pops up on screen. So maybe I like pop up a red circle and I say, as soon as you see that red circle, you got to hit the enter button. I can measure the time it takes for you to hit that enter button. That would be your reaction time. So that could be a way to measure a type of intelligence or some aspect of your nervous system that might be affected by marijuana. Okay, I like that. Other ways to measure intelligence or to measure our outcome. Someone different. I want to hear from some other people.
Maybe like emotions.
Okay, good. Yeah, how so?
Um, I don't really know. I just thought like I know it does affect your emotions. But I don't know how you would really test that.
So when you say emotions, how do you think it affects emotions? Like what
Um,
kind of emotions and what does it do?
um, I guess it can make you feel more like relaxed and like some people it affect makes them happy, some people makes them upset, like it's different stuff like that.
Okay, good. How would we measure emotions? Because you're right, that's difficult. That's something that goes on in here that you can't really observe super easily. But there are some ways that we observe it, right?
Yeah, maybe a group of people that doesn't smoke talk to like, or maybe like the same group of people um before they smoke have them talk to like a therapist or some like someone to like record like what they're saying, and then they smoke, and then after they record again what they have to say.
Okay, I like that because you're relying on an expert to make the the measurement, right? So it could be that emotion is something that we need to kind of measure in a very precise way. How do you think? I like that, but I want to make sure that we can actually kind of measure. We know exactly how we're going to measure it. We're not just going to rely on someone else to do it. I do think that's a good idea, but how would we measure someone's emotion, even if you were just like doing it casually? How do you know someone's experiencing an emotion?
You can use body or like facial expression, like how people like react to different things.
Using physical um, attributes to measure someone's emotional status isn't always reliable because there's a lot of people that do suffer with, once again, depression who can go through everyday life seeming fine. So I don't think that would be quite as an accurate way to distinguish and observe someone's um, mood.
That's a fair point. So there are ways that we do tend to judge people's emotions, right? So if we walk into a room and someone's crying, we make a pretty accurate guess usually that they're upset, right? So there is something we can observe. So maybe what we could do is say across a period of a week, we ask people to self-report. They record themselves how often they cry. Or we could ask, say, someone that they live with to record how often they have an outburst of some sort. So we could say, okay, an outburst, we could define that as someone raises their voice substantially more than it otherwise is. So the volume of their voice is much higher than usual. That could say indicate anger. None of these are perfect, right? Because I think you're right, Austin, is emotions are something that people kind of differ in how willing they are to express them. So, for example, on average, men compared to women tend to hide their emotions more. They might experience them just as often and possibly and just as intensely, if not more intensely than women do, surprisingly. But they might hide it. They might not show it. So, really relying on those external cues, they might be good, but they may also not be perfect. Other ways that we could measure, I don't know, emotion. I'll actually say this, just because we bring it up, emotion. There is a recent work that shows that if you measure people's anxiety, that is their level of worry, turns out people who smoke marijuana regularly, they in if you look at them physiologically, so there are physiological, like biological signs of anxiety, of being worked up, of being kind of aroused and like on edge. Physiologically, people who smoke marijuana regularly still experience that anxiety, but they are less likely to actually show it. So people who smoke are less likely to to actually kind of like show the anxiety that they're experiencing, or at least it's harder for other people to tell that they're experiencing that anxiety, funnily enough. All right, I hope what we've realized here is that when it comes to this outcome variable, the dependent variable, you can get kind of creative with it. There's often no correct, I mean, there's a better answer, but there's not always a clear correct answer that there's like, that's the way to do it. What you need to do is pick an pick an outcome and then justify it. Be like, okay, I'm going to measure intelligence using an IQ test. And then say, I'm going to use this test because of X, Y, and Z, because it's, it's established, it's a standard measure, people actually fill it out. Or maybe you're going to count the number of times someone cries per week because you are specifically, you specifically are interested in how does marijuana affect the expression of emotion, something like that. It's perfectly fine to do that as long as you justify why you're doing it that way. Okay, so we identified the independent, we identified the dependent. Now we need to operationalize our variables. So whenever it comes to an experiment and operationalizing an independent variable, what that means is you're going to split people up into different groups. So if our independent variable is how much marijuana you smoke, how do we operationalize that for our experiment?
It depends. There's a few different ways. First of all, especially if you eat marijuana, that can kind of do something a little different, especially with your respiratory system. The other is the amount of THC that's in the marijuana. And I guess the dosage amount that's been prescribed, if it's recreational marijuana, the amount you prescribe to each person.
Okay, good. So you're right. We could split people up into groups based on, say, dosage. But when we talk about dosage or maybe THC content, we still have to take into account how frequently they take that dosage, right? So maybe in one group, maybe what we do is we actually standardize all the groups and we say, okay, it's going to have, 80% THC content or something like that. And we just say every group is going to receive that dosage. However, that percentage. However, we are going to give group one, say, no dosage at all. They don't receive anything. In another group, we give them, say, 1 dose of that per day. The other group, we give them 1 dose of it per week. And so what we're specifying is how really the difference between the groups is how often they receive that dosage. And so presumably as people receive a higher dosage or a more frequent dosage, once every week versus once every day, that might affect our outcome. That might affect intelligence. So we can split this up any way we want. Yeah,
if they're smoking 80%, they're gonna be tripping. But I do see like you're given just like a random amount.
I'm just giving a random amount, though there are some very powerful strains out there. And what we've learned about marijuana is that there are some the really strong stuff. They can lead to instances of psychoticism, which is just a kind of scary way of saying that you are very likely to see or hear or feel things that you otherwise would not hear, see, or feel. Hallucinations.
And there's a lot of strains that have been breeded to be real high, and I think like super high is like 20% even. So 80, that would be crazy.
So dosage, are there any other ways that we could split these groups up? I mean, we could talk about, say, the number of, rather than focusing on the dosage, which I think is actually I think that's an important thing that you have to specify if you're going to do a study like this, but then you could, specify maybe what time of day they do it, right? So are you smoking in the morning before you have to do the things that you have to do for that day? Or are you asking people to smoke it in the evening after their day is done? And that might affect their performance on something, right? So these are the things to consider with an independent variable. Is you have to specify precisely what you're going to change. And you really should only be changing one thing while keeping everything else constant. We want to specifically see if I change the percent content of THC, is that going to affect the outcome? Or if I say change how frequently they receive the dosage, is that going to change the outcome? You have to be that specific. So when you're thinking of your own experiment, linger on these kinds of questions a little bit. Really be thoughtful. Think, okay, what do I have to account for here? All right, then you have to write out your hypothesis, which you will have already done and had practice doing. So in this case, our hypothesis might be something like, I predict that people who smoke more often will score lower on an intelligence test, or higher, whatever happens to be your hypothesis. Then you'll describe what participants will actually do. And so this is where you will run through and say, okay, I will randomly sample people from South Carolina, from the state of South Carolina, or I'll randomly sample people from the United States. Then they'll come into a lab, and I will randomly assign them into one of three groups, and then you define each of your three groups. Then you say what each of those groups is going to do. I'm going to say that the group that receives nothing, our placebo group, they are going to be instructed to smoke something, but that has absolutely no THC content in it. Versus, you're going to have the 10 milligram people, or the whatever dosage people, slightly higher dosage. They'll say smoke. You'll instruct them to smoke once per day, and then you'll instruct another group to smoke 3 times per day. However you want to do that, but you need to describe precisely, step by step. They're going to do this, and then they're going to do this, and then at the very end, I will have measured this to see how marijuana affected them. Does that outline follow? Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
All right. Let's see, how are we doing on time here? We still got a little bit of time. Just to run through this one more time, a little bit more practice. Let's take this example. How might we experimentally test whether video games cause people to behave more violently? Let's run through these steps. Someone take the helm.
It doesn't play at all. Somebody that plays an hour a day and somebody that plays 5 hours a day. And then, like, versus you don't want to get somebody playing Super Mario. You would probably want to, if people are looking for violence, they're probably after games like GTA or Call of Duty or something like that. So I guess you could even make a category, to be fair, to have somebody play those same times with a game like Mario or something.
Okay, so those are all good ideas. Remember, we got to pick one though. We're going to change one thing, keep everything else constant. So what is the one thing that we're changing between our groups? Okay, the time they play. So let's say that we're keeping constant what kind of game they're playing. Maybe they are playing GTA 5 or they're playing Call of Duty. That's the game they're playing. Now we're just going to change the time that they spend playing. So what is the time that they play video games? What is that within our design? What's the term for that?
Maybe the amount of maybe the I've seen experiments where people write papers about where you get the people that were playing the games to write papers about their feelings and to see who has more aggressive emotions in their papers.
Okay, good. I like that. Sure. You could have people do like a self-reflection task where they just write out what they're currently feeling. And you could say count the number of times. A lot of people do kind of it's a word analysis where they count the number of types of words. And so you might see more aggressive types of words, for example, and that could be your dependent variable. How many aggressive words does someone write in this reflection? Okay, that's one way to do it. Other ways.
Um, how angry a person can get, because anger is a form of violence.
Okay, good. So we could ask people to, yeah, have a video recording of them and then have other people, kind of rate, okay, how angry does this person look? Now, I will say anger and violence is not quite the same thing. You can be extremely angry, but that doesn't necessarily make you violent. But you're right that often anger can precede violence. So maybe we can at least say these video games are going to change your anger, even if we can't directly say violence. Is there any way we could actually get at violence, though? Because violence is a funny thing to measure. I mean, it almost seems unethical to measure. You can't actually say, okay, now go out and, if you feel like beating up on someone, go ahead. I think one of my favorite methods for doing this is they actually have people participate in this learning game where there's a teacher role and there's a student role. And the teacher is supposed to get the student to learn something, and they're instructed that every time that the student gets something wrong, what they can do is they can give them this sound blast. So it's just like this blast of really staticky noise, and it's really uncomfortable to listen to. And so the idea is you have them play a video game, you have them do whatever you think, in this case, video game, and then to measure violence, you're allowed to adjust the volume of that noise blast. And so the idea is that if you are blasting someone with a higher volume of noise, that maybe that indicates greater violence. You're causing this kind of physical discomfort in another person. It's not quite the same thing as true violence, but it's pretty close. Okay, so we have to get creative about that, right? Think about how you would measure violence. Make sure you operationally define them. How are you going to split people up into the different groups? How often are they going to spend playing a video game? Write out that hypothesis and then go step by step. What are participants going to do? How are you going to recruit them? How are they going to be assigned to each group? What will they do in each group? And then, of course, how you will measure it afterwards, and what kinds of things you'd be able to conclude from your data. These are all considerations you're going to have to make for your research proposals.
Well, I know there have been studies on it in the past. How have scientists in the past measured violence? And since it's a tricky subject.
Yeah, So I followed this literature for a little bit, but I haven't kept up with it. So I don't know where the newest stuff lies. I know that there are basically there are genuinely two camps of scientists who argue both ways. And my impression, though, is that the people who say that it causes no violence tend to, I think they have very good evidence for that case. I think they have very good evidence that video games in and of themselves do not cause people to be more violent. However, the camp that says that it does, at this point, I think they acknowledge that it's not necessarily going to cause everyone to be more violent, but it could, for certain individuals who already have a predisposition to be violent, give them a means to act out those feelings that they already have. So the idea is not that video games are making you violent, but it could potentiate, I don't know if you're familiar with that word, but it could actually kind of set someone up who already has that predisposition to behave more violently. That is, it's kind of like, it's like throwing wood on a flame that already exists. The video game is not creating the flame, but the video game could stoke it. Or is that right? Stoke it? Yeah, stoke it. Make it hotter. But again, I haven't kept up with it. I would say within the past like 5-6 years or so. So I think that I am not the best person to comment on that literature.
Okay. When I get some free time, I think I'm gonna look into it because it's a bit of an interesting topic to see how the scientists measured level of violence when we figure out how tricky of a subject it is to measure.
I'll warn you, it's a deep, complex literature. I mean, there's just tons of work out there. So I would not do a simple, Google it and see what kind of pops up. What I would do, actually, if you want to really get to like the source of information, rather than Googling something, use what's called Google Scholar. Google Scholar, if you search in Google Scholar, it'll actually take you directly to those peer-reviewed journal articles. So you can read the data yourself.
Yeah, I've used Google Scholar a lot for my English papers.
Excellent. I'm glad that's catching on. Good. Yeah, if you find something and you kind of want to report back to us, I would love to hear. If you kind of find what I would do is, if anyone else is interested, if you do something like Google Scholar or any kind of database where you can search for these articles, you can organize it by year. I recommend kind of limiting it to the past several years. You can do like 2017 onward. And if you find a good review article, or maybe they don't gather their own data, but they have summarized what data exists, that's a good way to kind of to begin your search. Find a good recent review article. All right, this is some practice with experiments. You'll be doing this again and again and again. So it's important that if there's something that we've gone over here that you don't feel comfortable with, or you're just still not getting, please reach out to me, let me know. We'll probably practice this at least one more time before you have to do your first research proposal, but it's important that the earlier you understand it, the better. All right. Okay. So I want to leave that there for now, for the end of chapter 2, for the end of research methodology. Please do not forget this information. It'll come back again. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to move on to chapter 3. And this is, I think, one of my favorite chapters to teach, in part because I really like biology. Now, I want to, I'm going to do a little poll here real quick. All right, just respond to this. I'm not going to show responses, so we're not going to see, but how many people here actually enjoy biology? And please be honest, because I want to know how many people, you take a biology class and you're just like, yeah, that's my shit, I love that, versus not so much. Okay. So far what I'm seeing, okay, cool. It's about an even split, 4 and 3. I will say this, I really enjoy biology, but I recognize, I empathize with people who do not enjoy it. And so my intent here is to teach you precisely what you need to know to appreciate just how important biology is to understanding how the mind works. There are a lot of little, the nervous system is, your psychology is created by your biology. Your nervous system is a biological organ. So if you want to understand how the mind works, you really can't understand it very well unless you know how that biological system works, how your nervous system works. So I want to linger on this a little bit and kind of introduce you to what's to come in the next week. So just from your, I don't know, just why do you think we need to understand the biology of psychology? I mean, what do you think, those of you who are into biology, or maybe you're not into biology, what do you think we could potentially get from studying the nervous system and biologically how the nervous system creates the mind? What do you think we could get? Well, why study the biology of psychology?
The physical results of psychology.
Okay, how so? What do you mean by the physical results?
Well, let's say the difference between somebody who that doesn't have a mental illness and say somebody that has schizophrenia. We can say we can use that to say, all right, this person has a mental illness and this is the effects it has on their body. Maybe their hair is can fall out from stress, or just shaking, or more anxiety.
Okay, good. So yeah, in a way, it ties, it treats the mind and body not as separate things, but as two things that are interconnected. Because you're right, when it comes to anxiety specifically, when it comes to stress, there are very real physical consequences to you feeling lots of stress consistently over time. Your hair, your hair can age more quickly. It can fall out. Your skin can actually age more quickly as well. So we'll find out that there's kind of an overlap between anxiety and those who excessively use stimulants like coffee and nicotine and stuff like that, which can also make you age more quickly, in part because your body is actually working more, your nervous system is working more quickly than it otherwise would. So it's kind of like you're burning through the resources that your body has more quickly than you otherwise would when you are stressed out. Stress is an emergency response by the body. It's a response to, oh my God, there's something I need to do. I better go do it really quickly. And so your body kind of sends a lot of sugars, a lot of fats into your muscles, et cetera, preparing you for that thing you have to overcome. So if you are constantly experiencing stress, your body's essentially in that emergency mode all the time, and that can over time lead to things like premature aging or things going wrong with the body. Yeah, they are interconnected.
Okay, so you mentioned nicotine and caffeine, and that sparked a question. Nicotine and caffeine, especially caffeine, is connected to higher stress levels and anxiety levels. But there's this group of people who testify that caffeine and nicotine actually help with their stress and anxiety. How is that?
So we'll learn a little bit about what happens when you persistently use a certain type of drug. Typically, you become dependent on it over time. This happens even with caffeine, where, if you've never had coffee before, you're not dependent on coffee. You might be groggy in the morning, but might not be like dog tired. If you use caffeine consistently, and then every morning you expect to have caffeine in your body will actually essentially need it to continue to work properly. So if you don't get that caffeine, you get withdrawal symptoms. Well, one of the withdrawal symptoms of really withdrawal of almost anything, but especially caffeine, is you can be very irritable. You're so tired, and you might have a headache and all these things that it feels stressful to not have caffeine in your system. So in those situations, what I would guess, this could probably get more complicated than we're describing, but what I would guess is these are people who already are physically dependent on caffeine or nicotine. And so by ingesting it, what they're doing is they're actually getting rid of the withdrawal symptoms of these drugs, rather than those drugs actually calming them down, if that makes sense.
I've had a terrible caffeine withdrawal because I drank coffee, like a good amount of coffee, every single day, like at least 2 or 3 cups. And one time I went to an event a couple of years back, and I was spending the night at a friend's house, and they didn't have any coffee. And so like that morning I was a little irritable, and then like around 4 o'clock I crashed. Like I was done for the day.
Yeah, and especially with if you're in a state of withdrawal, then getting the drug that you need can feel relieving. But it's not that the drug inherently has a relieving effect. It's that you probably really liked the stimulation when you started doing the drug. Then over time you became dependent on that drug, and then you simply needed the drug to feel kind of normal. We'll talk about that treadmill.
Yeah, I just like it.
No, sure. There's plenty to enjoy about caffeine. I drink tea too, but I've learned over time that if I drink caffeine too often, if I make it a habit, it ends up just being something that I have to do rather than something that I genuinely enjoy. Communicates information. We'll learn how the nervous system works, but essentially you have what are called neurons within your body, and these are cells that are specialized for conducting electricity, funnily enough. So when I say that it communicates information, you're actually communicating, you're sending electricity along these really long, kind of narrow cells that go throughout your body. So you have, for example, temperature receptors in your fingertips, that if you were to touch a hot stove, that hotness of the stove is information that needs to be communicated to the rest of your body. If your fingers are on a hot stove, your body is going to, and it stays there, your fingertips are going to get damaged. So your neurons, what they do is they send the signal up into your brain, and then that says, oh, you're touching something hot right now. And then the brain will send back a message that says, pull your hand away. And that happens very, very, very quickly, such that when you touch a hot stove, it feels like, oh, that was hot. You pull it away right away. But there is a delay where that electricity needs to first reach your brain, and then it needs to go back and innervate or kind of stimulate the muscles in your arm to pull your arm away, to pull your hand away. That's the point of your nervous system. It communicates information.
In other words, your reflexes.
Yes, your reflexes, but beyond that too. We'll see reflexes are a very particular type of response, but anything, even beyond a reflex, your nervous system is responsible for that. Speaking you listening right now, you having this kind of visual experience as you look at me, as you look at this slide, that is all controlled by neurons communicating electricity. So we'll see how that works. And another point that I'm going to make is that the nervous system makes predictions, funnily enough. I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but keep that in mind. Your nervous system communicates information, and eventually what it tries to do is, based on that information, it tries to make predictions about what's going to happen in the future. That's the whole reason we have a nervous system. Yes, sounds good. Thanks, William. All right. One term that I find very, very helpful, I hopefully will have enough time to get through this. We just talked too much. You guys were too active today. I want to introduce something called a heuristic. What we're going to learn and what I'm going to argue is that your nervous system is made up of these things. A heuristic, to define it, is a simple and efficient way of solving a problem. Something, a kind of a more kind of colloquial layman's term is, it's a rule of thumb for a particular situation. It's what you would typically do in a given situation. So let's imagine someone starts choking. What is your heuristic for when someone starts choking? What do you do by default? What is your immediate response?
Heimlich maneuver.
Heimlich maneuver. This is a heuristic that has been probably drilled into you ever since you were young. If someone around you starts choking, don't think about it. I don't want you to sit there and go, oh, what's happening? Oh, they're choking. What do I do in this situation? You immediately think, boom, go Heimlich maneuver. Get behind them, put your arms around them, put kind of fist with your thumb kind of tucked into your fingers, right below, kind of right above the bottom of the sternum. Put your other hand on top of that hand, push inward, and then pull upward. That's the Heimlich maneuver. They teach you that in CPR classes and such so that you can just immediately do all these steps. It's the rule of thumb that you follow. When we talk about neurons and the nervous system, we're going to see that the way that we string neurons together, the way that your nervous system is set up, is actually to create these kinds of rules of thumb, these heuristics, these things you just do automatically. How about this one? Here's a heuristic that you probably didn't have to learn. Let's say that you're just walking through, I don't know, you're out camping and you're walking along a trail, and then right next to you, just like a couple feet away, not super far, a bush rustles. What do? What's your heuristic? What's your rule of thumb? There's a bush rustling next to you. Okay, you jump, you get surprised.
And if you're carrying a firearm, you go for the firearm.
You might have these protective reactions. You jump. The other thing you probably do is you immediately turn your head towards it and you focus on it. That is a surprise heuristic. That is something that pretty much all organisms have, including humans. Even babies have it from very early on. If something surprises a baby, as long as that baby can actually turn its head, it has muscle movement. It has muscles within its neck to allow it to move its head. It's going to orient its head towards whatever surprised it. That is a heuristic that you have. If you are trained in firearms, yeah, you're going to have that heuristic where you immediately go for your weapon to make sure that you are defended, right? Does anyone else have a different heuristic? The bush starts to rustle. What do? Would anyone approach the bush? Would anyone approach the bush?
Some people would, but then some people would just automatically run away from it.
Right.
It's a
So
fight or flight response.
We each have different rules of thumb in a given situation. If you're maybe a little braver, maybe you kind of have some experience in nature, you kind of realize what kind of rustle that might be, and you're willing to go, okay, I'll get in there and see what that's all about. All right. These are heuristics. These are rules of thumb. They are tendencies to do things and tendency to do something in a certain situation. Next class, we're out of time. What I'll do is I will try to maybe revisit heuristics a little bit, kind of go over a few more examples and tie it together with what we're going to learn this coming week. So everything is posted online as usual. Watch the videos, do the assigned readings, take that exam, submit your next hypothesis, and I will get you feedback on your first hypothesis sometime this afternoon. All right? Questions? Concerns? All right. Thank you, everyone. You have a wonderful rest of your week.